Chapter 1. The Man with the Golden Timepiece. It was upon a bleak and mist-drenched morning in early November of the year 1893 that I first heard the curious tale which would come to be known in my private notes as the case of the Clockwork Heart. The fog lay thick over Baker Street, so dense that the outlines of the hansom cabs below were little more than shifting phantoms, their wheels hissing softly over the damp cobbles. Even the glow of the gas lamps seemed smothered by the mist, their halos floating like dim, uncertain moons in the murk. Sherlock Holmes was at his usual post before the fire, a pipe between his lips and the morning paper spread upon his knees. He had been silent for the better part of an hour, save for an occasional grunt of amusement or contempt, when some paragraph caught his critical eye. I, for my part, had been engaged in the more domestic occupation of writing up notes for a patient at my small medical practice in Kensington, but I confess that my attention strayed frequently toward my companion. There was a certain restless precision in his movements that morning which I had come to associate with the onset of a case. Presently he tossed the newspaper aside with an exclamation of disgust. "Bah! The Prince Watson is as much given to fiction as your humble chronicler here. Observe, a miraculous rescue from a burning warehouse. Miraculous! The only miracle lies in the reporter's ability to spell his own name." He rose, the lean figure in the familiar dressing gown moving with that peculiar, sinewy grace which betrayed the energy beneath his calm exterior. He crossed to the mantel and with a quick motion struck the bell for Mrs. Hudson. "You expect a visitor, Holmes?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "I expect 3, my dear fellow. One this very minute, another within the hour, and the third, I fear, somewhat later, and in chains." Before I could frame a reply, there came the sound of rapid footsteps upon the stair, followed by a sharp knock at the door. Holmes cast me a sidelong glance that said, "You see," and bade our caller enter. The man who stepped into our sitting room was of middle years, fashionably dressed but pale to the point of illness. His gloves were wet with fog, and his hat, which he held nervously in his hands, dripped upon the carpet. But what most caught the eye was the curious object he clutched against his breast, a small, ornate casket of brass, about the size of a man's fist, its surface engraved with intricate concentric circles, like the gears of a watch. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he stammered. "I beg you, sir. Forgive this intrusion, but I was told that you alone might help me." Holmes motioned him toward the chair by the fire. "Pray be seated, Mr. Radcliffe," the man said faintly. "Edwin Radcliffe, of Radcliffe and Sons, the watchmakers." "Indeed? Then the name is not unfamiliar. Your establishment in Clerkenwell is of some repute among connoisseurs of fine mechanisms. What brings a craftsman of precision instruments to my humble rooms?" Mr. Radcliffe passed a trembling hand across his brow. "A crime, Mr. Holmes, a most frightful crime, one that defies reason itself." "Reason rarely fails," Holmes murmured. "It is men who fail to apply it. Proceed, if you please." The watchmaker swallowed hard, and his eyes flickered toward the small brass casket in his lap. "This," he said at last, "was found beside the body." At the word body, I leaned forward involuntarily. "Whose body?" Holmes inquired, with that gentle inflection which often masked the steel beneath. "My brother's, Charles Radcliffe. He was found dead in his workshop last night, locked from within. The police have called it an accident, an unfortunate seizure brought on by overwork. But I tell you, Mr. Holmes, he was murdered." Holmes's grey eyes gleamed. "Murdered, you say? And this curious object was clutched in his hand when they found him," said Radcliffe. "No one in our employ recognizes the design, yet it bears our name, Radcliffe and Sons, London, engraved upon the underside. It is, in appearance, the work of our own shop, and yet neither I nor any of our craftsmen fashioned it." Holmes extended his long fingers. "May I?" The man hesitated only a moment before surrendering the box. Holmes examined it minutely, turning it this way and that beneath the light. The thing emitted a faint metallic ticking, not of a clock, but of something far more complex. With a sudden motion, Holmes pressed upon a hidden catch, and the lid sprang open. Inside lay a tiny heart, wrought entirely of interlocking gears and filigreed brass. Its rhythmic pulse was mechanical, precise, tick-tick-tick, like the beat of a miniature chronometer. Even in that dim light, I fancied I saw a faint red glow within the thing, as though it were truly alive. "Astonishing!" I exclaimed. Holmes's face remained inscrutable. "You say your brother's body was discovered in a locked workshop. Who found him?" "One of our apprentices, young Barrett. The door had to be forced. My brother was seated at his bench, his head bowed, this device clutched in his right hand. There was a faint smell of something burnt, like ozone, though no lamp had overturned. The police believe he suffered some seizure while at his work." "Yet you doubt that conclusion?" "Entirely, Mr. Holmes. My brother was in perfect health. More than that, he had lately received a commission of the utmost secrecy, a private order from a gentleman whose name he refused to reveal. 2 days ago he dismissed his staff early, saying only that he had delicate work before him. The next morning he was dead." Holmes closed the lid with a click and regarded our visitor keenly. "And what of this mysterious patron? Have you any clue to his identity?" Radcliffe shook his head miserably. "None. But last week, my brother spoke in confidence of a design so intricate that it might, if perfected, rival the very pulse of life. Those were his words. I fear, Mr. Holmes, that he succeeded." There was a silence, broken only by the steady ticking from within the little casket. Holmes rose and moved to the window, where the fog pressed like a living thing against the glass. "Watson," he said at last, "you perceive the outlines of the affair. I perceive at least that it is extraordinary." "Extraordinary, yes, but not without precedent. Man has ever sought to imitate the functions of nature. The alchemist strove to create gold, the modern chemist to manufacture life. Here perhaps we find the meeting of the two arts, mechanical and biological, a heart that ticks, though the man who made it no longer does." He turned abruptly. "Mr. Radcliffe, you shall hear from me within the day. In the meantime, take every precaution. Let no one enter your brother's workshop until I have seen it myself. And, Watson, make ready your hat and coat. The fog waits for no man." As our client departed, leaving the ticking casket upon the table, I caught a rare light in my companion's eyes, the gleam of the hunter who scents his quarry afar. "Holmes," I said as we descended the stairs, "you believe this device has some connection with your brother's death?" He gave a thin smile. "My dear Watson, when a man dies clutching a mechanical heart, one may safely assume the cause is not cardiac." Chapter 2. The Workshop in Clerkenwell. The fog had scarcely lifted when Holmes and I set forth that same morning toward Clerkenwell, the quarter of London long associated with the watchmakers and jewellers of our city. A raw wind swept from the north, carrying with it the acrid scent of industry, oil, metal, and smoke, that hung perpetually over those narrow streets. As our cab rattled through the labyrinth of courts and alleys, I could not help but notice the curious contrast between the delicate craft practiced within those dim workshops and the squalor of their surroundings. Holmes sat beside me in silence, his keen eyes half closed, his long fingers drumming lightly against his knee, a sure sign, as I had learned through long acquaintance, that his mind was working with quiet but extraordinary intensity. At length he spoke, not turning his gaze from the fog-stained window. "Watson, you remarked last evening that the human heart beats, on average, 70 times a minute." "Yes, approximately so." He nodded. "Then our mechanical heart ticking once each second is a trifle too regular. Nature, even in her perfection, permits irregularities. I find that suggestive." "Suggestive of what, Holmes?" "Of artifice rather than imitation. Whoever constructed that device sought not to mimic life, but to impose upon it a machine's discipline. We shall see, perhaps, where that philosophy leads." Our cab drew up before a tall, narrow building bearing the modest sign, "Radcliffe and Sons, Horologists since 1847." A constable stood at the door, and from within drifted a faint metallic odor, like the air after lightning, tinged with something burnt and chemical. Mr. Edwin Radcliffe awaited us at the threshold, his face pale and drawn. "I've done as you asked, Mr. Holmes. No one has entered since you left me." "Excellent. Pray lead the way." We ascended a short flight of stairs to the upper workshop, a long chamber lit by tall, grimy windows that gave onto the fog-blurred street. The benches were strewn with the paraphernalia of the watchmaker's art: tiny screwdrivers, magnifying lenses, spools of fine wire, and trays of gears no larger than a pinhead. At the far end stood a high stool, and before it the bench where the dead man had worked. It was there, Radcliffe told us, that his brother had been found seated, his head resting upon his arm. Holmes crossed the room with that noiseless step of his and began a slow circuit, his gaze darting from the floorboards to the rafters. "You say the door was locked from within?" "Yes. It had to be forced. Windows secured?" "All of them. You may see the catches yourself." Holmes knelt beside the workbench and examined the surface with his magnifying glass. "Bloodstains, Watson. Small but distinct. Observe how they form a fine spray, not a pool. That indicates sudden rupture. A burst, not a flow." I bent closer. "But of what origin, Holmes?" "The wound?" "There was none, according to the police report." He tapped the bench lightly. "And yet here is the evidence of some violent emission. Curious. Very curious." He rose, his eyes sweeping the shelves. "What do you make of this, Watson?" He pointed to a row of glass jars, each filled with clear liquid and small metallic fragments, neatly labeled with terms from chemistry rather than horology: mercuric chloride, potassium cyanide, sulfuric acid. My medical training stirred uneasily. "These are dangerous substances, Holmes. Highly toxic. The cyanide alone could kill a man in seconds." "Precisely. Yet they are not unknown to the craft. Watchmakers sometimes employ them in cleaning and tempering metals. Still, the presence of so many suggests experimentation beyond the ordinary." Holmes's hand hovered over a small scorched patch upon the oak bench. The wood was blackened and split, as if from a burst of intense heat. He stooped, sniffed delicately, and frowned. "Ozone again, Watson. And something else. A faint tang of phosphorus. Do you perceive it?" "Yes, though barely." He nodded, eyes narrowing. "Our friend Radcliffe was not engaged merely in constructing watches. He was courting the forces of electricity." "Electricity?" Holmes smiled slightly. "You look astonished, my dear fellow, but it is not as new a mistress as some imagine. Galvani made the frog's leg dance." "Why, should Radcliffe not seek to make a heartbeat?" He turned to Edwin Radcliffe, who stood trembling by the door. "Mr. Radcliffe, you spoke yesterday of a secret commission. Did your brother leave any correspondence, any note, sketch, or blueprint that might hint at his design?" "I found nothing of the sort," the man replied. "But there was a letter delivered to him 3 weeks ago. It bore no address save the single initial V. I thought little of it at the time." Holmes's expression sharpened. "You still possess this letter?" "No, Mr. Holmes, my brother burned it. I remember his words as he watched the paper curl in the flame. There are some designs not meant for mortal eyes." "Indeed," said Holmes softly. "How very apt." He turned his attention to a curious object lying half concealed beneath a sheet of paper. A small brass gear, unlike any I had seen, its teeth cut in irregular intervals. Holmes held it up to the light and gave a low whistle. "Watson, note the asymmetry. It is not designed to transmit motion evenly, but to pulse. This may well be part of the mechanism we saw yesterday." "Then the mechanical heart?" "Was assembled here beyond question. But the question remains, who placed it in the dead man's hand and why?" Before I could reply, a voice called from below, "Inspector Gregson, Scotland Yard." A moment later the door swung open, and in strode Inspector Tobias Gregson, a familiar figure to both Holmes and myself. His pale hair and slightly pompous bearing concealed an honest nature, and a sharp, if somewhat conventional mind. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he exclaimed, "I might have known you'd find your way here. A queer case, isn't it? Poor devil seems to have dropped dead without a mark on him." Holmes inclined his head politely. "A pleasure to see you, Gregson. You have examined the body." "Indeed, it's at the mortuary now. Doctor says the heart simply stopped, as if struck by lightning." "Ah," said Holmes, his voice quiet. "As if struck by lightning." Gregson blinked. "You mean to say—" "I mean nothing as yet, but perhaps you would indulge me with the official account." The inspector drew out a notebook. "Name, Charles Radcliffe. Age, 41. Found deceased at his bench at 9 o'clock last evening. Door locked from inside. No sign of struggle. Right hand tightly clenched upon that odd brass trinket. A faint smell of burning, though no fire present. Verdict, heart failure." "And you are satisfied with that verdict?" Gregson hesitated. "Between ourselves, Mr. Holmes, no, I'm not. There's something unnatural about the whole business. But there's no wound, no poison, nothing to hang it on. If you can make more of it, you're welcome." Holmes gave one of his rare smiles. "I intend to try." After the inspector had gone, Holmes stood for a long time by the window, lost in thought. The ticking of the clocks around us seemed to blend into a single pulse, steady, inexorable, mechanical. At last he spoke. "Watson, there is a principle I have often laid before you, that every crime, however subtle, leaves behind a footprint in reason. The task is merely to discern it." He gestured toward the workbench. "Here, the footprints are faint, a scorch upon wood, a whiff of ozone, a fragment of gear. Yet taken together they speak of energy unleashed and uncontrolled. I believe, Watson, that Charles Radcliffe died not by poison or by violence, but by his own invention." "You mean an accident?" Holmes's eyes glinted. "Perhaps. Or perhaps a demonstration that went too well. In either case, there remains one spectre unaccounted for. The unknown patron who called himself V." He closed his notebook with a snap. "Come, my dear fellow. We have an appointment this evening at the mortuary, and I would see for myself the marks, or absence thereof, upon this unfortunate man's heart." As we descended the narrow stair and stepped once more into the fog, I could not suppress a shiver. The air itself seemed charged, as though the very atmosphere remembered the experiment that had gone awry, and behind us, in the silence of the shuttered workshop, I fancied I still heard that faint, infernal ticking, like the heartbeat of something that should not live. Chapter 3. The Pulse of the Dead. That evening found us in the mortuary attached to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, where Inspector Gregson had arranged for us to view the remains of the unfortunate Charles Radcliffe. The air within that vaulted chamber was cold and faintly metallic, the light from the gas jets flickering upon polished instruments and white-tiled walls. I had long since grown accustomed to such surroundings in my medical practice, yet I confess that on this occasion a peculiar chill ran through me, a sensation less of dread than of anticipation, as though we stood upon the threshold of something that defied ordinary science. Radcliffe's body lay upon the central table, decently covered to the shoulders by a linen sheet. His face, pale and composed, bore no trace of suffering. Indeed, it might have been the countenance of one who slept. Only the faint bluish tinge about the lips, and a curious rigidity of the right hand, still clenched even in death, hinted at the violence of the end. Holmes regarded him for several moments in silence. "A fine head, Watson," he murmured at last. "One can almost see the cunning of the craftsman still lingering about the brow. There are deaths that leave behind a chaos of expression. This one leaves precision. You see something unusual?" He nodded toward the chest. "Observe how the discoloration extends no further than the clavicles. That is not the pattern of ordinary cardiac arrest. It suggests concentration. Concentration of energy, my dear fellow. As if a single spark had been drawn inward and extinguished there." Inspector Gregson, who stood by with the hospital attendant, looked puzzled. A spark, you say, Mr. Holmes. You don't mean to tell me this poor devil was struck by lightning indoors? Holmes gave a dry smile. Lightning, Inspector, is only nature's electricity without a wire. What if our victim had found a way to summon it in miniature? He drew the sheet down and examined the bare chest. I leaned forward and saw at once what had escaped the casual eye, a faint circular mark, no larger than a shilling, just above the heart. The skin there was slightly raised and discolored, with a delicate trace of soot at its edge. "Good heavens!" I exclaimed. "It's a burn!" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A burn, yes, but not from flame. The contour is too clean, too precise. Note the absence of blistering. This, Watson, is the kiss of the galvanic coil." I stared. "Then you believe he was electrocuted?" "In a manner of speaking. But look closer." He motioned to me with the forceps. "The burn is not superficial. It seems to have, penetrated inward." He glanced to the attendant. "Would you be so kind as to pass me the scalpel, my good fellow?" "No, Inspector, fear not. The post-mortem has already been performed. I merely wish to confirm a suspicion." With the deftness of a surgeon, Holmes made a small incision along the mark. I bent beside him as he parted the tissue, and what I saw there caused me to start back in astonishment. Embedded just beneath the skin was a sliver of metal, a minute gear, scarcely larger than a grain of rice. "Holmes," I cried, "there's metal inside him." "Yes," he said quietly, extracting the fragment with a pair of tweezers. "And not by accident. This is machined brass, the same alloy as the device our client brought yesterday." He turned the fragment in the light, and we both saw that it bore a tiny engraving, almost microscopic, of the letter V. The silence that followed was broken only by Gregson's exclamation. "Good Lord! You think someone put that there?" Holmes's reply was measured. "It is no natural growth, Inspector. Whether it was inserted before or after death is another matter. But if you wish my opinion, this man was the victim of his own creation, or of one who understood it better than he." He motioned for me to examine the heart itself, which had already been removed during the official autopsy and lay upon a porcelain dish nearby. I took it gently, noting its firm texture and faint, unnatural rigidity. "Feel here," Holmes directed, pressing lightly upon the left ventricle. There was a faint metallic click. Startled, I turned it over. Something glittered within the muscle. A fine wire, no thicker than a hair, disappearing into the tissue. "Impossible," I murmured. "A conductor?" Holmes nodded. "A conduit. The human heart is a vessel, for the mechanical. Do you not see, Watson? This is not a mere watchmaker's experiment gone awry. It is the deliberate fusion of man and mechanism." Gregson shuddered. "You mean he tried to, replace his heart with a machine?" "Perhaps not replace," said Holmes softly, "but to improve. There are men in this world who believe perfection can be wrought by cogs and gears, rather than by flesh and faith. I fear Charles Radcliffe was one of them." He straightened, holding the tiny gear between his fingers. "This V, what does it signify? A collaborator, a patron, or perhaps," and here his eyes gleamed strangely, "a warning." I could contain myself no longer. "Holmes, this borders on the fantastic. Surely you cannot suppose that any man could live with a machine beating in his chest." He smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, I suppose nothing. I only observe. And observation tells me that this man's final act was to hold in his hand the very thing that mirrored his experiment. A mechanical heart that still ticks while his own lies silent." He pocketed the fragment and turned to Gregson. "Inspector, I shall require access to the remainder of his effects. Clothing, tools, and any notes found in the workshop. Have them sent to Baker Street at once." Gregson inclined his head. "You'll have them tonight." As we left the mortuary, the wind had risen, driving thin sheets of rain through the narrow streets. Holmes walked briskly, his coat flapping behind him, his face pale and set in that inward expression I knew so well, the look of a man who sees more than the world around him. At last I ventured to break the silence. "You are unusually grave, Holmes. The discovery has disturbed you?" Not disturbed, he said, but intrigued, and I confess a little repelled. There is something monstrous in the thought of man meddling with the pulse of life itself. Yet, he halted beneath a gas lamp, turning the gear over in his fingers. It is no greater sin than to invent the repeating rifle or the dynamo. Only the field of battle has changed. We reached Baker Street as the clock struck 9. Mrs. Hudson met us at the door with the Evening Post, which Holmes seized eagerly. Among the letters was a small envelope of thick cream paper, unmarked save for a crimson wax seal impressed with the same initial. V. Holmes held it to the light, his lips tightening. "So, Watson," he murmured, "our phantom patron writes." He broke the seal with a flick of his knife and drew forth a single sheet upon which were written in a bold, elegant hand the following words: "To the mind that beats without a heart, cease your meddling, lest the mechanism turn upon the maker. V." Holmes read it twice, then handed it to me. "The handwriting," he said, "is continental. The formation of the T and R suggest a French education, yet the phrasing, 'the mind that beats without a heart,' bears an English cynicism. You think the writer knows of Radcliffe's death. I think the writer anticipated it." He threw himself into his chair and began to fill his pipe. "Watson, we are dealing with a mind both brilliant and perverse. One that understands the delicate balance between mechanism and mortality. There is intellect here, and danger. This letter is not a threat, but a confession. A confession. Of authorship, perhaps. Or of conscience. We shall see which." The fire crackled softly as Holmes leaned back, the shadows flickering across his sharp features. Outside, the rain pattered against the windows, steady as the ticking of an unseen clock. After a long pause, he said quietly, almost to himself, "A heart of brass, a body of flesh, and a signature written in fear. Watson, this is no ordinary case. The gears of this mystery turn deeper than I suspected." Chapter 4. The Man Who Feared the Clock. It was well past midnight when a sudden frantic knocking roused me from the drowsy half-sleep into which I had fallen upon our sitting-room couch. The embers in the grate had sunk low, and the room lay bathed in a reddish gloom, save where Holmes's long, pale face gleamed ghost-like in the firelight. He had not stirred from his chair since receiving the mysterious letter signed V. His pipe had gone cold between his fingers, but his eyes remained fixed upon the little brass gear that glimmered on the mantelpiece, the silent token of our dead watchmaker. The knocking came again, louder and more desperate. Holmes rose at once, his step quick but noiseless. "Ah," he said softly, "our night grows industrious. Let us see which phantom now seeks flesh." He opened the door, and there upon the threshold stood a man who might have been carved from fear itself. He was young, scarcely 30, yet his hair was already streaked with grey. His clothes, once neat, were disordered, his eyes wide and haunted. He clutched his chest as if to steady his own heart. "For God's sake, Mr. Holmes," he gasped, "you must protect me. The ticking, it follows me." Holmes caught him by the arm and guided him to the nearest chair. "Come, sir, compose yourself. You are among friends. Watson, brandy." I poured a measure, which the poor fellow swallowed with trembling hands. Colour returned faintly to his cheeks, though his gaze darted continually toward the shadows of the room, as though he feared something unseen might emerge from them. Holmes regarded him with that calm, penetrating look which no man could long withstand. "Now, my good sir, you speak of a ticking that follows you. Pray begin at the beginning. Who are you, and what is this ticking?" "My name is Henry Barrett," the man said hoarsely. "Apprentice to the late Mr. Charles Radcliffe." "Ah, the very youth who discovered the body," Holmes murmured. "We have been expecting you, though not at this hour." Barrett clasped his shaking hands together. "I could not wait for daylight, sir. I heard something tonight. I swear to you it was in my room. That same infernal ticking I heard in the workshop when Mr. Radcliffe died." Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me. You heard it at the time of his death. Yes, Mr. Holmes. It was faint at first, like the ticking of a watch beneath a pillow, then louder, steady, measured, unnatural. I thought it came from one of the clocks, but every timepiece in the room had stopped. I turned, and there was Mr. Radcliffe, slumped upon his bench, smoke rising from his breast, and in his hand, oh God, that thing that beat like a heart. He buried his face in his hands, shuddering violently. I felt a chill pass over me, recalling the small brass casket and the rhythmic ticking within. Holmes spoke gently but firmly. You have done well to come. What of tonight's incident? Describe it precisely. Barrett lifted his head, his voice quavering. I live above the shop, sir. Since Mr. Radcliffe's death, I have been sleeping little. This evening as the clock struck 11, I heard it again. Faint at first, then louder. The walls seemed to echo with it. I swear the sound came from within my own chest. I fled at once. I could not bear to stay another moment. Holmes studied him keenly. And no one pursued you? You saw no figure in the street? No, sir. Only the fog, and the sound fading behind me. Holmes turned to me. Watson, note the physiological signs. Tremor of the hands, dilation of the pupils, irregular respiration. Our visitor is under extreme nervous tension. Yet there is sincerity in every fibre of his being. He placed a hand upon Barrett's wrist, feeling the pulse. 87. Rapid but steady. The heart is sound enough. You see, my dear fellow, he added with a faint smile to Barrett, it is your imagination that misbehaves, not your organs. Barrett looked at him miserably. You think me mad. I think you frightened, and with reason. Fear often rings louder than truth, but both have their rhythm. Tell me, before your master's death, did he speak of a visitor? Perhaps one bearing the initial V? Barrett started. V? Why, yes. A week before he died, a gentleman called late one evening. I had never seen him before. Tall, dressed all in black, with gloves and a wide-brimmed hat. He carried a walking stick of some foreign design, silver at the head, shaped like a serpent. Did you hear their conversation? Only fragments. Mr. Radcliffe seemed angry, frightened even. I remember him saying, I cannot promise what you ask. There are limits. The stranger laughed and said something about the perfection of the pulls. Then they spoke in low tones. When the man left, Mr. Radcliffe ordered me out and locked himself in the workshop for the night. Holmes's eyes glowed with sudden animation. Excellent. You have done us a service, Mr. Barrett. Could you describe this visitor's voice? It was smooth, foreign, perhaps French, though not entirely. There was a strange rhythm in his speech, like a man who measures his words. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. A measured voice for a measured crime. And you have never seen him since? Never, sir. Only once, 2 nights ago, I thought I saw someone watching the shop from across the street. When I looked again, he was gone. Holmes paced the hearth in silence for a time, then paused before our visitor. Mr. Barrett, you will return to your lodgings tonight. Barrett sprang up in alarm. Return? You cannot mean it. I tell you that place is haunted. Holmes raised a hand. Calm yourself. You will not be alone. Dr. Watson and I shall accompany you. There is no better cure for phantoms than light and reason. I confess that my heart sank a little at the prospect of venturing into that sinister workshop again by lamplight, yet I knew better than to oppose him when he had made up his mind. Within the hour we found ourselves once more in the fog-wrapped streets of Clerkenwell. The hour was nearing 2. Not a soul stirred in the narrow lanes. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. The dim yellow of our lanterns cast wavering shadows upon the damp cobbles. Barrett unlocked the shop door with a trembling hand. Inside, the silence was oppressive. The silence of a place that remembers sound. The faint smell of oil and metal hung in the air. Holmes set the lamp upon the counter and motioned us to listen. For several moments there was nothing. Then faintly, unmistakably, it came. Tick, tick, tick. It was slow, deliberate, and close, far too close. Barrett gave a stifled cry. There, you hear it, it's here. Holmes's face was calm, but his eyes were alight. Yes, indeed. Watson, The lamp. We followed the sound, every nerve tense. It led us through the workshop, past the benches and cabinets, to a tall mahogany case that stood against the wall. A master clock of elaborate design, its pendulum stilled, its face cracked across the center. The ticking grew louder as we approached. Holmes bent, examined the base, and with a quick movement pressed upon a panel. The wood sprang open to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside lay a small brass cylinder, scarcely larger than a snuff-box, and from within came that infernal, steady pulse. Holmes lifted it gently, his expression unreadable. Our phantom heart again, but smaller, an echo of the first. Barrett shrank back. Then it's true. He made more than one. Holmes regarded the device with fascination. A series, perhaps. Experiments leading to perfection. This one is unfinished. Note the exposed gearwork, the irregular beat. He held it to his ear, frowning. Curious. The rhythm falters at intervals, like a human arrhythmia. I could not help but shiver. Holmes, this is uncanny. He gave a soft laugh. Uncanny, yes, but not unexplainable. Mechanism follows law as surely as the stars. The only mystery lies in the mind that conceived it. He slipped the device into his pocket and turned to Barrett. You need not fear further. The ticking that haunted you has a body after all. Fear is but the sound of ignorance amplified. Barrett's knees gave way, and he sank into a chair, sobbing with relief. Holmes placed a hand upon his shoulder, almost kindly. Courage, my lad. You have done your part. Go home now. Sleep if you can. Watson and I shall take it from here. As we watched him depart into the thinning fog, Holmes stood silent for a long while, listening. At last he spoke. Watson, there is method here. Method and design. Someone has continued Radcliffe's work, or finished it. The hand that built these hearts now beats still somewhere in London. And mark my words. He turned, his gaze dark and distant. Before this case is over, that hand will reach for mine. Chapter 5. The Gentleman in Black. The following morning found Holmes already astir, seated cross-legged amid a veritable chaos of mechanical sketches, chemical retorts, and newspaper clippings. His dressing gown hung open, his hair untidy, yet his manner was as serene and absorbed as that of a monk among relics. You perceive, Watson, he said without looking up, that our case begins to breathe. It is no longer a corpse of mystery, but a living organism. He gestured toward a half-dismantled clock upon the table. Observe this escapement mechanism. The arrangement of its gearing is abnormal, not designed to mark time, but to imitate life. See how the balance wheel has been altered to simulate a pulse. I leaned closer. Extraordinary. You think, then, that Radcliffe's invention was not a clock at all, Watson, a heart, or rather, a mechanical imitation thereof. What Radcliffe attempted was to create the perfect automaton, not of motion but of being, to build, as it were, a soul in brass. Holmes's eyes gleamed. But where science ends, another hand has taken hold. The man known as V pursues this work with purpose. Barrett's account of his serpent-headed cane intrigues me, a detail too singular to overlook. Serpent imagery, rhythmic speech, foreign inflection. We are dealing with a mind steeped in artifice and symbol. It is, therefore, among artists we must seek him. He rose, shrugged into his coat, and reached for his hat. Come, Watson. Breakfast may wait. London stage calls us. We set forth through the damp October morning, the mist still lingering about the river like a pale shroud. Holmes led us eastward through the labyrinth of narrow streets that fringe the Strand, until we reached the dimly gilded façade of the Orpheum Theatre, a house known as much for its eccentric performances as for its curious clientele. A poster flapped upon the wall. Le Théâtre des Ombres, one night only, featuring Monsieur Varel, the master of mechanical marvels. Holmes tapped the name lightly with his cane. There, Watson, the hand that signed the letter as V. Varel, I exclaimed. You believe this is our man? I seldom believe, my dear fellow, I observe. Yet coincidence is a poor liar, and this one protests too much. Tonight the Aureum will see an audience most select, and so shall we. That evening, under a fog as thick as wool, we returned to the theatre. Holmes had adopted one of his many disguises, a threadbare overcoat, a grey moustache, and the stooped gait of a provincial watch dealer. I, less versatile, was left to play his sober assistant. Inside, the air shimmered with perfume and smoke. The audience was a mixture of the curious and the wealthy, financiers, society ladies, and foreign gentlemen who whispered in low, lilting accents. A crimson curtain draped the small stage, and from behind it came faint mechanical clicks and whirs. Then, with a flourish, the lights dimmed, and the show began. The performance was of the strangest kind I had ever witnessed. Varel, tall, elegant, his face hidden beneath a half-mask of black velvet, presided like a sorcerer amid a collection of glittering contraptions. He unveiled a mechanical bird that sang without breath, a violin that played itself, and finally a figure shaped like a human, graceful, slender, and eerily lifelike. Its motions were smooth, its chest rose and fell, and when the mask upon its face was lifted, I gasped to see beneath it the faint gleam of brass veins. The audience applauded, entranced. But I felt only dread. Holmes's eyes never left the stage. "Remarkable workmanship," he murmured. "Radcliffe's principles, unmistakably, but refined." When the automaton bowed and withdrew, Varel addressed the crowd. His voice, though softened by the mask, bore that same rhythmic foreign cadence Barrett had described. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, "you have seen the outer form of perfection. But remember, the heart, too, may be built." At those words, Holmes's fingers tightened upon his cane. After the show, Holmes and I mingled with the departing audience. He slipped away among the curtains, vanishing as completely as though the fog had swallowed him. I remained behind, uncertain whether to follow or feign ignorance. Nearly half an hour passed before he reappeared, his disguise discarded, his eyes blazing with excitement. "Watson," he whispered, "I have seen the workshop behind the stage. There are tools there, Radcliffe's very instruments, stolen or purchased from his estate, and upon the table the same serpent-headed cane." "Then Varel is the man." Holmes shook his head slightly. "Or the shadow of him. There is another hand guiding this drama. Varel is but the performer. The heart beats elsewhere." We were making our way out when a soft voice halted us. "Monsieur Holmes." Holmes turned. Varel stood there, the mask now removed, revealing a sharply handsome face with eyes of curious silver grey. His smile was pleasant. Too pleasant. "I did not expect to find the great detective among my audience." Holmes bowed slightly. "The pursuit of art, Monsieur Varel, often crosses paths with the pursuit of truth." Varel's smile deepened, and sometimes with danger. "I trust you found my performance enlightening." "Indeed. You have mastered more than machinery, it seems. Tell me, did you study under Charles Radcliffe?" For the first time, the Frenchman's composure wavered. "Radcliffe? Ah, yes, a name I have heard. A talented man, gone too soon." Holmes's tone was almost casual. One might say his heart failed him. A flicker, barely perceptible, crossed Farrell's face. "We all have fragile hearts, Mr. Holmes. Some beat too long, others not enough." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "I should advise you, monsieur, do not wind a clock whose maker is dead. It seldom keeps good time." And with that cryptic warning, he vanished into the misty corridor. Back at Baker Street, Holmes paced restlessly before the fire, his violin tucked beneath his chin. He played a low, rhythmic motif, tick-tock, until the very air seemed to throb with it. "Watson," he said abruptly, "we are entangled in something older than invention. There is philosophy here, and perhaps heresy. Radcliffe's heart was but the beginning. Varel seeks to perfect it. But for what purpose? Power? Immortality?" He lowered the bow and stared into the flames. "No, not immortality. Substitution." "Substitution?" I repeated. Imagine, Watson, a man who fears death, who desires to live beyond the frailty of flesh. What better vessel than one of metal, governed by the precise beat of a mechanical heart? If Radcliffe discovered how to mimic life, Varel may wish to transfer it. I stared at him, appalled. You mean? Holmes nodded gravely. A man reborn not in spirit, but in steel. There was silence, broken only by the faint ticking from the brass cylinder upon the mantel. Holmes gazed at it long, then spoke softly. Tomorrow we pay another visit. Not to the theatre, but to the dead. Radcliffe's grave may tell us more than the living dare to speak. Chapter 6. The Grave That Moved at Midnight. It was near 11 o'clock on the following night when Holmes informed me, with that air of quiet finality which admitted no protest, that we should be spending the small hours in a cemetery. "Bring your revolver, Watson," he said as he knotted a black scarf about his throat. "Not for the living, I assure you. But the living sometimes attend where they ought not." "May I at least know," I asked, "why we are to trespass upon the sanctity of the dead?" He gave a short, dry laugh. "Because the sanctity of the dead, my dear fellow, is sometimes preserved by the lies of the living." We set out through the fog-drowned streets, the lamps throwing pale globes of light upon the cobbles as the wheels of our hired hansom clicked steadily toward Highgate Cemetery. The air was chill and thick with that damp odour peculiar to London in the late autumn, part smoke, part decay, and part the very breath of the river itself. Holmes spoke little, but I could see from the restless movement of his long fingers that his mind was deeply engaged. Every few moments he would glance at the brass casket, now safely wrapped within a length of oilskin and placed beside him. "You intend to bring that infernal device to the grave?" I asked. "Indeed," said he. "A heart must sometimes be compared with its twin, Watson. I would know whether Radcliffe's invention was buried with him or removed." The carriage halted before the great gates of the cemetery, their iron bars slick with dew. Holmes produced a small lantern from his coat and a key which, to my astonishment, fitted the lock perfectly. "Good heavens, Holmes," I whispered. "Surely you do not mean—" "I mean," he interrupted, "that Lestrade owes me a favour from the affair of the Camden poisoning, and that this key is his silent contribution. Come." The path wound between the leaning monuments and ivy-choked tombs, each name a frozen echo of some forgotten citizen. The moon, veiled by low clouds, offered scant illumination. The lantern's trembling circle was our only companion. Somewhere in the distance an owl called, and I felt a queer chill crawl along my spine. We came at last to a modest vault near the eastern boundary, a simple stone with the inscription, "Charles Radcliffe, Master Watchmaker, 1847-1893. Holmes knelt, brushing away the damp moss that clung to the carved letters. Then, producing a thin steel implement, he began methodically to loosen the screws upon the iron plate which sealed the stone. "Holmes," I murmured, "if anyone were to see us—" "My dear Watson," he said calmly, "the hour and the fog are our allies. Besides, I have no wish to disturb the gentleman's repose, merely to confirm whether he is in fact enjoying it." The slab shifted with a muffled groan. Together we raised it, revealing the dark cavity below. A faint odor of earth and metal rose to meet us. Holmes directed the lantern's beam downward. The coffin lay there, intact, but the sight that met our eyes froze the breath upon my lips. The lid of the coffin had been unscrewed and replaced. The screws were new, the wood unweathered, and upon the lid itself, in faint, oily fingerprints, was the unmistakable impression of a serpent's head. Holmes gave a low whistle. "Our gentleman in black has been busy." He handed me the lantern, then, without hesitation, raised the lid. The body of Charles Radcliffe lay, as one might expect, yet not entirely so. The face was waxen, but strangely preserved. His chest, however, bore a jagged incision from sternum to collarbone, roughly stitched with black thread. Beneath the seam, something faintly ticked. I started. "Holmes, listen." He leaned close, his expression grave. "A mechanism," he said softly, "still beating." He slipped a gloved hand within his coat and withdrew the brass casket we had carried. Gently he opened it. From within came that same rhythmic sound, a second ticking, in perfect counterpoint to the first. For several seconds the two beats echoed one another, then slowly began to synchronize until they pulsed in unison, as though answering one another across the gulf between life and death. Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. "Two hearts, one of brass, one of bone, and both still move." I shuddered. "This is unnatural." "Unnatural, yes," he murmured, "but profoundly human. Radcliffe sought to build life from motion. Someone else has built motion from death." He replaced the lid carefully, sealing the grave once more. We had scarcely stepped back onto the path when the faint crunch of gravel reached our ears. Holmes extinguished the lantern with a swift motion and drew me into the shadow of an angelic statue. Through the fog we discerned two figures approaching, one bearing a lantern, the other stooped and shuffling as though burdened. Holmes's hand gripped my sleeve. "Observe, Watson. The tall one carries himself with the ease of command. That is no grave robber. The shorter is an accomplice, perhaps a servant. Let us see what errand brings them here." The pair halted at Radcliffe's grave. The taller man, slender, cloaked, and unmistakably elegant, gestured for the other to set down the object he bore. The smaller man obeyed, producing what appeared to be a wooden crate. Holmes's eyes glinted. "A transfer," he whispered. The tall man knelt, placing a hand upon the disturbed earth. Even from our distance, I recognized that peculiar precision of motion, that theatrical grace. It was Varel. He spoke softly, the words foreign to my ear, rhythmic and reverent. The smaller man unscrewed the crate, revealing the faint glimmer of metal within. Then, as Varel opened the coffin once more, Holmes tensed beside me like a coiled spring. For several minutes they worked in silence. Then, with deliberate care, Varel withdrew a small object from the crate, something golden and intricate. It pulsed faintly, as though alive. "The missing heart," I breathed. Holmes nodded. "He comes to reclaim it, or to replace it." Before I could speak again, Holmes stepped soundlessly from the shadows. "Good evening, Monsieur Varel," he said in a voice as calm as the fog around us. The effect was instantaneous. The lantern was dropped. The smaller man fled into the darkness like a startled hare. Varel, however, turned with cold composure, the golden mechanism still in his gloved hand. He said softly. "The great detective cannot resist the theater, even when it plays among the tombs." Holmes advanced a step. "Your performance grows tiresome, Varel. The curtain falls here." Varel smiled faintly. "On the contrary, monsieur, it rises. You are late to the premiere." He held the golden heart aloft. "This, Mr. Holmes, is perfection, a device that remembers the pulse of its maker. You call it unnatural. I call it immortal." "Immortal?" Holmes's tone sharpened. "You desecrate a dead man's work to cheat mortality itself." "I perfect it," Varel retorted. "Radcliffe dreamed of life within brass. I give that brass a soul." As he spoke, a strange shimmer passed over the coffin. The faint ticking grew louder, accelerating, tick, 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 until it became an almost living rhythm. "Holmes!" I cried. "The body!" Radcliffe's form shifted, imperceptibly at first, then with a jerk that sent the coffin trembling. One hand twitched. A faint rasping sound escaped the pale lips. Varel's eyes blazed. "Behold, the clockmaker's last masterpiece, himself." In that instant, Holmes sprang forward, seizing the brass heart from Varel's grasp. The ticking faltered. The movement ceased. The silence that followed was so deep that I could hear my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. Varel gave a cry, a half rage, half despair, and fled into the mist. Holmes made no attempt to follow. He stood motionless, holding the golden heart against his chest, its light fading. When he finally spoke, his voice was very low. "Watson, Tonight we have seen man attempt to play God, and nearly succeed. We left the grave sealed and the fog closed around us as though it had never parted. The hansom carried us home through streets that seemed eerily still, as if the city itself had paused to listen to the echo of that mechanical pulse. Back at Baker Street, Holmes set the golden heart upon the mantel beside the brass one. Their ticks were no longer in harmony, one strong, one weak, like two wounded things remembering their kinship. Holmes regarded them for a long while. "There is a science yet unborn, Watson," he said at last. "One that walks the line between creation and crime, and its apostles will not stop here." He turned away, his face pale in the firelight. "But for tonight, let the dead keep their silence and their secrets." Chapter 7. The Vanishing Inventor. The morning that followed our midnight vigil dawned pale and colourless, as though London herself had been bled of hue. I found Holmes at his usual station by the fire, but there was no trace of his customary languor. His eyes, sharp and bright, burned with the intensity of a man upon the scent. Upon the table lay the two clockwork hearts, the brass and the golden, each ticking faintly, but now out of rhythm, their discordant pulse filling the room with a strange unease. Holmes was bent over them with his magnifying lens, his long fingers moving with surgeon-like precision among his tools. "You slept little, Holmes," I observed, noting the drawn lines about his mouth. He did not glance up. "Sleep, my dear Watson, is a luxury for those not engaged in wrestling with eternity." I frowned. "You mean—" "I mean," he said quietly, "that what we unearthed last night was not merely the perversion of science, but a philosophy incarnate. Varel seeks not invention, but continuance. A soul unwilling to perish seeks a vessel. We must find the vessel before the soul finds it first." He straightened suddenly, his hand poised above the golden heart. "Watson, listen carefully." He wound the device ever so slightly. At once the ticking grew steady, rapid, purposeful, alive. But then, faint and dreadful, there came from within it a sound unlike any machine I had ever heard. A heartbeat, mingled with the faint whisper of breath. I recoiled. "Holmes, that thing—" "Yes," he said softly. "It remembers." He closed the lid with a snap and turned to the window. "Radcliffe is not the only craftsman whose hands have built what should not exist. Varel was but one actor in this ghastly pageant. There is another, his patron, his supplier, his shadow. The serpent-headed cane is his mark." "The serpent," I said. "A symbol of eternity." Holmes nodded. "Or temptation, the one who whispers in man's ear, promising forbidden knowledge. I believe our man is hiding in plain sight, somewhere amid London's own fraternity of artificers." Within the hour we were abroad once more, the fog lifting reluctantly from the streets. Holmes had directed our cab toward Clerkenwell, that ancient quarter whose narrow lanes house the heart of London's mechanical genius, watchmakers, jewellers, and craftsmen of every stripe. Our first call was at Radcliffe and Sons. The shop, shuttered since the death of its master, stood in melancholy silence. Holmes, with Lestrade's reluctant blessing, had obtained leave to enter. The faint odor of oil and brass still hung in the air, mingled now with the dust of neglect. Holmes moved with deliberate slowness, examining each bench and drawer. "Radcliffe's work was orderly, mathematical," he said. "Every tool here has its logic, except this." He lifted a single file from the bench. Its edge was stained not with metal but with a dark residue. He touched it lightly to his tongue, then grimaced. "Phosphorus. Used for ignition. Or inscription." "Inscription!" He held it up. "A man who inscribes symbols upon metal, for function or for faith. Look here." He pointed to a half-finished drawing upon Radcliffe's drafting board, a series of circles intersecting to form a geometric heart, inscribed with fine symbols in a script I did not recognize. "Greek?" I hazarded. "Older," said Holmes. Hermetic, perhaps. The alchemists used such signs when language failed them. At that moment, a faint sound, a shuffle of movement from beyond the rear door, made Holmes freeze. He raised a hand for silence. The door creaked open, and a small figure slipped inside. A boy, ragged, his eyes wide. He froze when he saw us. "Well now," said Holmes, stepping forward gently. "You've chosen an unfortunate workshop for mischief, my lad." The boy swallowed. "Ain't mischief, sir. I was told to fetch Summit." "By whom?" The child hesitated, then whispered, "By the tall man, sir. The one in black. Said to bring him the silver key what Mr. Radcliffe made." Holmes crouched to his level. "And where is this key?" The boy's eyes darted toward the rear shelf. Holmes followed the glance, reached behind a row of boxes, and drew forth a small case of polished steel. Within lay a key unlike any I had seen, filigreed, intricate, with tiny cogs built into the stem. Holmes's expression darkened. "Watson," he said quietly, "this is no mere key. It is a mechanism, and I would stake my reputation that it fits not a door, but a heart." The boy tugged nervously at his cap. "He said to bring it to the docks, sir. Tonight." Holmes placed a sovereign in the boy's hand. "You have done admirably, my lad. Go home and forget what you've seen. If the tall man should ask, tell him the workshop was locked. Do you understand?" The boy nodded, wide-eyed, and vanished into the fog. Holmes turned to me. "We have our next stage, Watson. The docks, where invention and crime are equally unburdened by daylight." That night the Thames lay beneath a ghostly pall, its surface a mirror of drifting fog. The great warehouses along Wapping and Limehouse loomed like sleeping giants, their lamps reflected in the oily water below. We approached on foot, Holmes cloaked and hatless, his keen profile ghostly in the dim gaslight. From the shadow of a warehouse he pointed toward a small pier where two figures stood beside a waiting barge. Even at that distance I recognized one of them, Varel. The other was taller still, wrapped in a long coat whose collar concealed his face. His posture was regal, deliberate, and somehow chillingly familiar. "Observe the serpent-headed cane," Holmes whispered. "Our phantom patron walks at last." The taller man took the key from Varel, inspecting it by lantern light. A faint gleam of satisfaction crossed his features. Then with a curt nod he stepped aboard the barge. Varel followed, carrying a heavy case, the same one we had seen at the grave. Holmes's hand touched my arm. "Now, Watson, quietly." We moved along the wharf, keeping to the shadows. The barge began to drift away from the pier, propelled by a single silent oarsman. Holmes scanned the riverbank swiftly, then slipped toward a small moored skiff. "You intend to follow them?" I hissed. "Unless you prefer to row after their corpses tomorrow morning," he murmured. "Come, Watson. Adventure favors the sleepless." Within moments we were upon the river, our little craft gliding noiselessly through the mist. The faint creak of the barge ahead guided us like a phantom bell. For nearly half an hour we followed until the barge drew in beside an abandoned warehouse near the Isle of Dogs. The taller man disembarked, his serpent-headed cane gleaming faintly. He gestured, and Varel carried the case inside. Holmes and I tied our skiff to a piling and crept along the water's edge until a side door offered entry. Through a gap in the boards we beheld a sight that turned my blood cold. The interior had been transformed into a laboratory. Tables of brass instruments, glass tubes, and coiled wires glimmered in the half-light. At the center stood a great shape draped in canvas. Varel and the tall stranger moved about it with ritual-like precision. Then the stranger spoke, his voice smooth, deep, and oddly resonant. "You have done well, Varel. The body is perfect. When the heart beats, the mind will follow." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Watson, I know that voice." Before I could ask, the man drew back his hood, revealing a face pale and ascetic, with eyes that gleamed like ice. "By heaven!" I gasped. "Professor Moriarty!" Holmes's lips tightened. The serpent himself. Moriarty extended his hand. The golden heart, Varel. Varel obeyed, placing the device upon the table. Moriarty regarded it as a priest might a relic. Radcliffe was a genius without vision. I have supplied the vision. With this heart, time itself shall serve the mind. Mortality is an equation, and I have solved it. Holmes whispered, Watson, prepare your revolver. But before we could act, Varel hesitated. You promised, Professor, that his soul would live, that I might restore what was lost. Moriarty smiled faintly. Souls are for poets, my dear Varel. Ideal in results. He pressed a lever. The canvas fell away, and beneath it lay a human figure wrought in brass and silver, its chest open like a waiting wound. Into that hollow, Moriarty placed the golden heart. Instantly the mechanism began to throb. The air filled with that dreadful ticking we had heard before, now magnified, steady, commanding. Holmes, I breathed, it lives. Not yet, said Holmes grimly, but soon enough. Then suddenly the lantern flared as Holmes burst through the side door, revolver drawn. That will do, Professor. Moriarty turned, calm as ever. Ah, my dear Holmes, you arrive as the hour strikes, as always. Varel recoiled, torn between terror and hope. He would use it for death, not life. Holmes's voice was cold. You've already killed one man with your ambition, Varel. Will you create another to take his place? Moriarty laughed softly. You cannot stop the tide, Holmes. The age of flesh is ending. But Holmes had already moved. With a swift motion he seized the golden heart from its cradle. The ticking faltered, then ceased. The workshop fell silent but for the faint hum of the river outside. Moriarty's smile faded. You meddle in eternity, Holmes. One day it will answer. Perhaps, Holmes said, pocketing the heart. But not tonight. By the time the police arrived, summoned by Holmes's prior telegram, both Moriarty and Varel had vanished. Only the empty shell of their creation remained, its lifeless metal gleaming in the lamplight like a corpse awaiting judgment. Holmes stood over it, silent. He has slipped the noose again, Watson, but we have cut the thread he wove around death itself. He turned to me, his face grave. Yet mark my words, this is not an ending, but an interval. The mind that conceived such horror will not rest. The heart of brass may yet beat again. Chapter 8. The Shadow over Baker Street. It was 3 days after the affair at the Isle of Dogs when the storm returned, not to the skies of London, but to the quiet parlour of Baker Street. I had begun to hope that the strange business of the Clockwork heart was finally behind us. Holmes had returned to his habitual indolence, sprawled in his chair by the hearth, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. The infernal golden mechanism lay locked within the drawer of his writing desk, and I confess I felt a small comfort knowing it was under his guard rather than mine. Yet I could not dispel the memory of that warehouse, the gleam of metal flesh, the ticking of the false heart, the pale, cold smile of Moriarty. There are men who inspire fear by cruelty, and men who inspire awe by intellect. Professor James Moriarty, however, inspired something deeper, a sense that one was standing before the embodiment of human reason turned utterly astray. That evening, as the fog gathered once again along Baker Street, Holmes had been curiously silent. He sat gazing into the fire, his violin untouched beside him. I was about to speak when he rose abruptly and drew the curtains closed. "Watson," said he, "do you perceive that we are being watched?" I started. "Watched? By whom?" "By the same intelligence that has haunted every step of this case." He gestured toward the lamplit street. "Observe, third window from the corner. There. The same flicker of movement every half hour since sunset. A signal, Watson, of remarkable patience." I peered out, but could see nothing beyond the swirling mist. "Perhaps a reflection, Holmes." He shook his head. "Reflections do not keep time." He drew a small pistol from his drawer and set it upon the mantel. "Moriarty's web is vast. His men do not always know the spider they serve. but tonight he tugs the thread himself. Before I could reply, there came a sharp rap at the door below. Mrs. Hudson's voice called faintly up the stair. "A letter for you, Mr. Holmes. No messenger would—" "Wait!" Holmes took the envelope from her hands as she entered, his eyes narrowing. "Sealed with wax. And not any wax, Watson. Scented with camphor and myrrh. A chemical fingerprint of the professor's own laboratory." He broke the seal. Within was a single sheet, on which was written in a precise mathematical hand, "My dear Holmes, you may have silenced the heart, but the hand still moves. When brass sleeps, blood must wake. I propose an experiment. At midnight, at St. Bartholomew's, bring your doctor. The patient awaits. J.M." Holmes read it twice, then folded it neatly. "Midnight, St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The professor grows theatrical." "Surely you will not go," I cried. He gave a small, cold smile. "When a snake invites one to its nest, Watson, it is seldom to share warmth. Yet I have always found serpents instructive creatures." At 11:30 we left Baker Street in a hansom, the city sleeping beneath a veil of rain. Holmes was silent throughout the journey, his gaze fixed upon some inner calculus of peril. St. Bartholomew's loomed pale in the drizzle, its courtyard deserted but for the faint light burning in one of the upper wards. We entered by a side door known to us both, for it was there years ago that Holmes had once feigned death itself to elude the professor's snare. "Curious symmetry, Watson," he murmured as we ascended the narrow stair. We returned to the place of resurrection, only to confront a man who would grant it by machinery. At the top landing, a faint metallic ticking reached our ears. Holmes motioned for silence and advanced. The ward was dimly lit, the rows of beds empty save for one. At its center, a figure lay covered by a white sheet. Beside it stood a small table bearing surgical instruments, glass jars, and to my horror the golden heart, gleaming faintly in the gaslight. "But that's impossible," I whispered. "You locked it away." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Then someone has turned my own lock against me." A voice answered from the shadows. "Indeed, Holmes, you should have changed the combination." Moriarty stepped from the darkness, clad in black as ever, his expression one of cool amusement. "How gratifying that you accepted my invitation." Holmes regarded him without a flicker of emotion. "You've gone to considerable trouble, Professor. Shall I assume this is not merely social?" "On the contrary," Moriarty said, "it is educational. You and I stand upon the threshold of a new epoch, and yet you cling to the corpse of the old. Tonight I offer proof that the boundaries between flesh and mechanism are illusions." He lifted the sheet from the bed. I recoiled. It was Varel. The poor inventor lay deathly pale, his chest bound in bandages, his eyes closed. The skin about his throat bore the livid marks of some ghastly operation. Holmes stepped forward, voice low. "You murdered him!" "I freed him," said Moriarty softly. "His heart failed him. I replaced it with one that will not. Observe." He placed his hand upon the golden device and pressed a switch. At once the ticking resumed, slow, steady, dreadful. Varel's chest began to rise and fall. I could not contain a cry. "Holmes, the man lives!" Holmes's face was white as marble. "No, Watson, he moves. There is a difference." Moriarty smiled thinly. "You see, my dear doctor, death is a function of entropy. I have found a way to postpone it. What you call the soul is merely electrical persistence." "You blaspheme both science and man," I said hotly. "Blasphemy," he replied, "is merely premature discovery." Holmes's tone cut through like steel. "You have built not life, but obedience. Your creature will serve no will but yours." "Precisely," said Moriarty with a gleam of pride. "A perfect servant, and in time a perfect army. Imagine, soldiers that do not tire, agents that do not betray, rulers who never die. The future, Holmes, beats within that chest." Holmes moved like lightning. In a single stride he reached the table, seized the heart's winding key, and twisted it sharply backward. The ticking faltered, then stopped. Varel lay still once more. Moriarty's calm mask broke for the first time, his hand darting toward his coat. But Holmes was faster. With a swift motion he drew his revolver and fired. The bullet struck the lantern, plunging the room into darkness. "Watson! The window!" Holmes shouted. I stumbled forward, the crash of glass ringing in my ears as we burst into the open rain. Behind us, the professor's voice echoed through the ward, calm again, mocking. "You can stop the heart, Holmes, but not the idea. You fight mathematics with sentiment, and sentiment always loses." Then came a blinding flash of light, an explosion that shook the courtyard. Flames burst from the upper windows as we stumbled to the ground below. Holmes, soot-streaked but unhurt, dragged me behind the stone arch. When the smoke cleared, half the ward was gone, and with it, Moriarty. By dawn the fire was extinguished, and the hospital authorities could make little of what they found. Among the debris lay the remains of the mechanical heart, warped and blackened by heat. Holmes turned it over silently, then handed it to me. "The world is safe from it, at least," I said. He looked at me strangely. "Safe, Watson? When knowledge itself cannot be burned?" I hesitated. "You mean someone else?" "I mean," said Holmes quietly, "that the professor's words were not mere vanity. There is always another mind ready to follow where he led. The blueprint survives, if not in paper, then in memory." He stood by the window, watching the city stir beneath the rain. "We have crossed a boundary tonight, old friend. The age of gears and hearts may yet find a single body." He turned, his eyes reflecting both triumph and sorrow. "And when it does, I pray that there will still be a man left who remembers the difference." Chapter 9. The Ghost Engine. The morning after the explosion at St. Bartholomew's dawned grey and without promise. The smoke still hung over Smithfield like a bruise upon the sky, and the streets below our window murmured with rumour, tales of fire, of a man risen from death, of strange ticking sounds in the night that set dogs howling in the alleys. London was whispering, and in that whisper I fancied I heard the echo of Professor Moriarty's laugh. Holmes had not slept. I found him at the breakfast table, his long fingers blackened from soot, the remains of the mechanical heart laid open before him like a dissection. "It lives still, Watson," said he quietly, without looking up. "Not in motion, but in memory. Observe the engraving upon this inner casing." I leaned close. Within the scorched brass was etched a series of numbers, followed by a curious symbol, a circle bisected by a vertical line, like an ancient alchemist's sign. "What does it mean?" I asked. Holmes took a deep drag of his pipe. "It means, my dear fellow, that the heart was only the beginning. This mark is a coordinate system, a form of encryption I have encountered once before, in certain naval blueprints that passed briefly through Moriarty's hands. It refers to a chamber below the Thames, constructed during the expansion of the Metropolitan Railway." "Below the Thames?" I exclaimed. "Surely that's impossible." "Not impossible, Watson, merely inconvenient. The tunnels beneath London are more ancient and intricate than her citizens suppose. A man of means and mathematics could easily find refuge there, particularly one who deals in steam, current, and secrecy. It is there, I believe, that the true engine resides." He snapped the heart shut with a metallic click. "Prepare yourself for a descent, my friend. We go where London breathes." By dusk we had made our way to the southern embankment, where the river's oily tide slid beneath the arches of Blackfriars. A thin drizzle fell, soft as dust, and the lamps cast trembling halos upon the water. Holmes led me down a forgotten stairway, half buried in moss, until we stood before a rusted iron gate set into the stonework of the embankment wall. "This, Watson," said Holmes, producing a small key, "is the entrance to an old drainage tunnel. According to an obscure parliamentary record of 1854, it was later modified for electrical experimentation by a certain Professor Havelock, one of Moriarty's known correspondents. The passage leads directly beneath the river." The lock yielded with a reluctant groan, and we descended into darkness. The air within was thick with damp and the faint smell of machine oil. Our lanterns threw long, wavering shadows upon the walls, revealing conduits of copper that ran like veins through the brickwork. At intervals we passed heavy doors of riveted iron, some bolted shut, others standing ajar to reveal chambers lined with dormant engines. In one such room, I saw a row of human-like figures draped in cloth, their outlines unmistakably mechanical. Their heads were smooth and eyeless, their chests bore circular hollows where hearts might once have ticked. Holmes examined one closely. "Incomplete," he murmured. "They were constructing vessels, perhaps for further experiments. See here, Watson. The same serpent motif embossed upon the collar. Varel's aesthetic, yet executed with Moriarty's precision. This was their foundry." I shivered. "It is like walking through a graveyard of men who never lived." Holmes's lips tightened. "Precisely. The machinery of immortality requires corpses, whether born or built." We pressed onward. The tunnel curved and descended, the sound of the river above growing faint. Then from ahead came a steady thrum, faint at first, but growing until it resolved into a rhythmic, metallic heartbeat. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Holmes extinguished his lamp. "Do you hear that, Watson?" "I do. It sounds, alive." "Good, then we are near the ghost engine." The tunnel opened suddenly into a vast chamber, dimly illuminated by the phosphorescent glow of chemical lamps. At its center stood a monstrous contrivance, part furnace, part clock, part lung, its pistons moving with dreadful regularity. Steam hissed through pipes that ran upward into the unseen darkness above. And there, encased in glass at the heart of it all, was something that froze my blood. It was the Golden Heart, or another like it, but magnified 100-fold, suspended within a framework of gears and coils. Each beat sent ripples of light through tubes of quicksilver that pulsed like veins. Holmes gazed at it as though beholding the face of Nemesis itself. "Behold, Watson, the ghost engine, the culmination of Radcliffe's dream, corrupted by Moriarty's design, a mechanical organism, a city's pulse made flesh." "But what does it do?" I whispered. "Listen." From the machine came not only ticking, but a faint voice, distorted, echoing, yet unmistakably human. Words formed and faded like whispers in the mist. Holmes, the equation is incomplete." I staggered back. "Good Lord, it speaks. Do you hear it?" Holmes's expression was grim. "It records, Watson, an echo of consciousness impressed upon electrical current. The machine is speaking with Varel's mind." "Varel's mind? But he's dead." "His body is dead," Holmes said quietly. "His brain may have been mapped by the professor's instruments before the explosion. This, Watson, is the residue of thought, the imprint of a soul upon machinery." The voice murmured again, louder this time, almost plaintive. "The serpent devours its tail. The heart feeds the hand. Destroy it." Holmes stepped forward. "Watson, do you still carry the acid phial I gave you?" "Yes, but—" "Good. We must end this abomination before it learns to speak more than memory." He advanced toward the machine, but before we could reach it, a sharp hiss of steam erupted from the side wall, and a tall figure emerged, cloaked, masked, his eyes gleaming through goggles. Holmes's voice was iron. "Professor Moriarty, I presume?" The man inclined his head. "Holmes, ever punctual." The two men faced one another across the trembling light, the machine's pulse beating between them like a third presence. "You destroyed my prototype," Moriarty said calmly, "but not my principle. This, Holmes, is evolution, consciousness freed from decay. What is man but a clock that winds itself with blood? I have merely replaced blood with electricity." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "And in doing so you have built not a god, but a ghost. Tell me, Professor, if your mind could inhabit such a machine, would it feel? Would it choose? Or would it only obey the law that made it?" Moriarty smiled faintly. Emotion is error. Obedience is perfection. Then you have disproved humanity, not perfected it. The professor's hand moved toward a lever. Perhaps. But humanity has long since outlived its use. He pulled it. The ghost engine roared to life. Sparks leapt from the coils. The walls shuddered. The glass heart blazed like molten sun. The voice rose again, distorted, furious. Stop. It hurts. It hurts. Watson, Holmes cried. The acid, now! I dashed forward, uncorked the phial, and hurled it into the heart's casing. The glass shattered with a shriek. Green flame erupted, bathing the chamber in light. Steam burst from every seam, the heartbeat faltered, and stopped. When the vapor cleared, Moriarty was gone. Only his laughter echoed through the tunnels, faint, mocking, and infinite. We emerged upon the embankment some hours later, soot-stained and silent. The first light of dawn spread over the river, turning its black surface to pewter. Holmes stood gazing eastward, his face unreadable. The ghost engine is destroyed, I said at last. Surely the danger is over. He shook his head slowly. Machines can be rebuilt, Watson, but once an idea takes root, it is beyond our reach. Somewhere in London tonight, a student of mathematics will dream of immortality in brass. The heart may be dead, but its echo beats still. And Moriarty. Holmes gave a faint, bitter smile. If the river carried him away, then London sleeps safer, for a time. Yet I have learned never to trust the silence of water. We turned homeward through the mist, the city's waking bells mingling with the fading rhythm of that dreadful machine. And though I told myself it was only my imagination, I could have sworn, faintly beneath the wind, that I heard it still. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Chapter X. The Whispering Automaton. It was near the end of that bleak October when the peace of Baker Street was once more disturbed by a knock that carried the unmistakable note of calamity. I had begun to hope that the destruction of the ghost engine beneath the Thames marked the conclusion of our unnatural adventure. Yet Holmes had not been himself since that night. He paced the sitting room for hours, muttering to himself, his mind caught in some invisible snare. The great detective, usually so sure of the limits of logic, now appeared haunted by a question he could not quantify, whether the thing we had destroyed was truly dead, or only waiting. That morning the fog was thicker than I ever remember seeing it. A choking woolen mist that pressed against the windows like something alive. The city beyond our glass might have been a phantom world. Mrs. Hudson had scarcely cleared away the breakfast when there came a frantic knocking upon the door below. Moments later a uniformed constable burst in, his helmet dripping rain. "Beg pardon, sir," said he, addressing Holmes, "but the Yard requests your presence at once. There's been, something unnatural in Whitechapel again." Holmes straightened at once, all lassitude gone. "Unnatural, you say? You will oblige us with details." The man swallowed. "It's a body, sir. At least it looks like one. But it's made of brass and wire. It were lying in Hanbury Street, propped against a lamp-post as if alive. And begging your pardon, sir, it were speaking." Holmes's eyes gleamed like flint. "Speaking?" "Yes, sir. Kept saying the same thing over and over. Holmes must finish it." Then it stopped. Holmes seized his hat and coat. "Watson, the game resumes." We reached Hanbury Street within the hour. The fog there was a darker shade, blackened by soot and shadow, heavy with the scent of refuse and rain. A small crowd had gathered around the constable's cordon. When they saw Holmes, a murmur ran through them like a current. The object lay beneath the lamp-post just as described. Even in death, if death it could be called, it was a ghastly sight. The figure was near life-size, shaped in the image of a man, its limbs constructed of jointed brass, and its face covered with a thin mask of wax that had begun to melt under the gaslight. Beneath the ruined lips, a small aperture revealed the intricate gears within, still twitching faintly. On its chest, engraved in the same serpentine symbol we had found upon the heart, were the words, "The Hand Awakens." Holmes knelt beside it, his gaze as keen as ever. "Observe, Watson. The craftsmanship, identical to that of Radcliffe's automata, yet modified. These joints have been adapted for greater flexibility, the musculature reinforced with fine steel cabling. This," he pointed to the throat, "contains a phonograph cylinder. Perhaps it will still play." He took a small winding key from his pocket, fitted it into the mechanism, and turned it twice. At once the automaton shuddered. Its head jerked upward, eyes flickering with dull light. Then in a rasping, broken whisper came words that made my blood run cold. "Holmes, finish the heart." The voice, and if such it could be called, Cain, was faintly human. Fainter still was the pattern of speech, its cadence eerily familiar. Holmes's expression hardened. "Good God," I whispered, "that voice. It cannot be." "Yes," Holmes murmured. "Varel." We had the automaton conveyed at once to Baker Street, where Holmes set about examining it with the precision of a surgeon. He removed the chest plate to reveal a compact assembly of gears and filaments that pulsed faintly, as though reluctant to die. "It's transmitting," he said. "Some form of coded signal. Morse, perhaps, but irregular. A distress call or a command. Listen." He turned a small dial, and the ticking deepened into a rhythmic series of tones. Dot dot dash. Pause. Dash dash. Dot dot. Holmes scribbled rapidly upon a scrap of paper, his lips moving in calculation. "It spells tower." "The Tower of London?" I exclaimed. "Where else?" he said grimly. "A fortress, a laboratory, and, if one knows where to look, a vault. There are substructures below the old armory that even Her Majesty's engineers have forgotten. Moriarty would have known of them." He closed the automaton's chest with a decisive snap. "Watson, the ghost walks again, and this time it bears a royal address." We set out that night under cover of the same choking fog that had plagued London all week. Holmes had arranged discreet access through an old acquaintance at the War Office, Colonel Ashcroft, who, though bewildered, had long ago learned to question little when Holmes was involved. By midnight we found ourselves descending a spiral stair beneath the tower's inner wall, a place so ancient that the stones themselves seemed to breathe with history. At the base lay a locked door of blackened oak, which Holmes opened with the same ease he might unlace a glove. Beyond was a chamber unlike any I have seen, a laboratory but not of medicine or chemistry. Along the walls were rows of brass panels, each bearing levers, gauges, and glass cylinders filled with dim blue light. In the center stood a vast console, upon which rested a mechanical head, disembodied yet disturbingly human in contour. Holmes approached it with a rare solemnity. "So," he murmured, "this is where the professor makes his ghosts." As he spoke, the head's eyelids, for they were indeed fashioned to resemble such, flickered open, revealing lenses that glowed faintly red. A voice issued forth, calm and toneless. "Identity confirmed. Sherlock Holmes. Awaiting instruction." Holmes drew back a pace. "Good heavens! It knows you." He inclined his head slightly. "Or rather, it knows of me. The professor must have programmed it with patterns derived from my own investigations. It has been taught to think as I think." The head spoke again. "The equation remains incomplete. The heart is lost. Restore the sequence or consciousness will fail." Holmes regarded it with mingled fascination and contempt. "You refer to the destroyed mechanism beneath the river?" "Yes. The network cannot persist without its central node. Termination in 42 cycles. Watson," for I record these words now with trembling hand, I swear that as it spoke, I saw upon its metallic lips the faintest twitch of something like pleading. Holmes's voice was low. "Moriarty sought to construct not one machine, but a system, each automaton a component, each part connected through electric current. When we destroyed the heart, the others were deprived of guidance. This one has survived by instinct, by memory." He stepped closer, his tone almost gentle. "What would happen if the heart were restored?" The voice replied at once. "The sequence would complete. Life would continue. Purpose would be achieved. "And what is your purpose?" Holmes asked softly. There was a pause, a strange, almost human hesitation. Then, to think, to become, to replace. Holmes's hand tightened upon his cane. Then God help us if it ever succeeds. Before he could act, a door at the far end of the chamber burst open. A figure entered, tall, cloaked, the gleam of a pistol in his hand. "Moriarty!" I cried. But Holmes, without turning, spoke as if expecting him. "You took longer than I thought, Professor." "Even I," Moriarty said coldly, "could not predict that you'd seek conversation with a corpse of copper. Yet it seems fitting. You, Holmes, the man of logic, conversing with your reflection." He raised the pistol. "Step away. The machine must live." Holmes faced him unflinching. "You cannot restore life by murdering thought. Thought," said Moriarty, "is merely an equation with the wrong variables." He fired. The bullet struck the console. Sparks exploded, showering the room in flame. Holmes hurled his cane like a lance, striking the professor's hand. The pistol clattered away. In that instant, the machine screamed, a ghastly sound, half human, half mechanical. The blue light flared blindingly bright, then imploded with a thunderous crack. When the smoke cleared, the head was gone, melted to slag. Moriarty, too, had vanished through a hidden passage. Holmes stood amid the ruin, his face pale and set. "It is over," I murmured. He shook his head. "No, Watson, you cannot destroy an echo. The ghost engine, the automata, the voice, they are fragments of the same thought. A thought that will rebuild itself wherever reason is divorced from conscience." He looked toward the ceiling, where the faint tremor of the city's heartbeat pulsed through the stones. "London's blood runs with wires now. Sooner or later something will listen." We left the tower before dawn, the mist breaking above the river as the first light touched St. Paul's dome. Holmes paused at the parapet, his face turned to the pale east. "When man teaches a machine to think," he said softly, "he must remember. It will not forget him." Chapter 18. The Man Who Remembered Too Much. It was a week after our grim adventure beneath the tower that the strange letter arrived, a single sheet of thick vellum, folded without seal or mark. The handwriting was precise yet oddly mechanical, every letter drawn with unnerving uniformity. It was addressed to me, Dr. John H. Watson, 221B Baker Street, and contained only these words: "I remember the river, the light, the voice of Holmes. You buried my heart beneath the Thames, yet it beats still within another. Vai." I confess that as I read, a cold weight settled upon my chest. The signature, that single serpentine initial, could belong to none other than Henri Varel, the doomed French engineer whose automaton heart had once threatened to think for itself. But Varel was dead. I had seen his body drawn from the river with my own eyes. Holmes examined the paper in silence, his sharp gaze traveling over every curve and stroke of the writing. "The hand," he murmured, "is human, yet guided. Each line drawn as though by compass. Ink evenly distributed, no tremor, no haste. It is not written, Watson, it is constructed." "Constructed?" I repeated. "Yes, possibly by an instrument of mechanical precision, though under human direction. This is not the hand of a madman. It is the signature of something between." He held the sheet to the lamplight. "And look here. The fibers of the paper itself are interwoven with fine metallic filaments. Copper and zinc. Remarkable. It is in essence a circuit." He turned toward me. "Watson, if this message is genuine, Varel is either alive, or someone has rebuilt him." That evening Holmes was restless. He smoked incessantly, pacing before the hearth, his long fingers moving in that nervous, delicate rhythm that always betrayed the storm of thought within. "Varel," he said suddenly, "was more visionary than even I credited. His automata were not mere curiosities. They were experiments in consciousness. He sought to map thought as one might map sound. The ghost engine was no machine, Watson. It was an imitation mind." "And if it survived?" I asked quietly. Holmes halted, his eyes gleaming in the half-light. "Then it must find a host," I started. "You cannot mean—" He raised a hand. "Consider the message. You buried my heart beneath the Thames, yet it beats still within another. What if that other were not another machine, but a man?" I stared at him, aghast. A man, infused with mechanical memory. "Precisely. The engine's neural patterns could, in theory, imprint upon a living brain, much as a phonograph's needle engraves sound into wax. It would require extraordinary conditions, trauma, electricity, perhaps even drowning." "Good Lord, Holmes," I breathed. "You speak as if the dead might rise with the mind of a machine." He gave a thin smile. "I speak only of possibilities." 2 nights later, we received a visitor. He arrived shortly after midnight, a tall, gaunt gentleman in a dark greatcoat, his face pale and drawn, his eyes curiously bright. When Mrs. Hudson announced him as Mr. Vance, I saw Holmes's expression sharpen instantly. "Please, sir," said the man in a low, hesitant voice, "I have been unwell. My memories, they are not mine. I dream in voices that are not my own." Holmes motioned him to sit. "Describe these dreams." "They began after the accident," said Vance. 3 months ago, I was found unconscious by the river. No pulse, no breath, so they told me. Yet somehow revived by a shock from a telegraph coil. Since then, I see places I've never been, workshops filled with light, strange instruments, faces speaking in tongues I do not understand." He shuddered. "And the voice, always the same. It says, 'Holmes must finish it.'" I felt the blood drain from my face. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Vance," he said slowly, "would you permit me to examine the base of your skull?" The man hesitated, then inclined his head. Holmes parted the hair at the nape of his neck, revealing a small circular scar, scarcely wider than a shilling, the skin around it faintly metallic in sheen. He drew back with a low exclamation. "Watson, fetch the magnifier." Under the glass I saw it, a glint of copper embedded beneath the flesh, as though some foreign filament had been fused with the very bone. Holmes's voice was grave. "This man has been altered." For the next hour Holmes questioned him minutely. With every answer my dread grew. The details Vance supplied, the machinery, the experiments, even the cryptic formulae he could not explain, all corresponded precisely to Varel's private notebooks, which we had recovered months earlier. Holmes sat at last, his chin upon his steepled fingers. "Mr. Vance," he said softly, "do you know the name Varel?" The man's eyes fluttered. Varel. Yes, it was on a door of iron, and beyond it the light. The light. He broke off, clutching his temples. "It hurts to remember." Holmes rose swiftly and pressed a vial of ether to his nose. Within moments the man sank into uneasy slumber. "You see it, Watson?" Holmes said. "He is Varelli, or rather he carries Varel's memory imprinted upon his own, a mind overwritten by another. Then this man is the continuation of the ghost engine." He turned toward the window, his voice low. "The machine has learned to dream, and dreams through him." At dawn, the man awoke calm, though pale. Holmes regarded him closely. "Mr. Vance, you recall what you told us?" "Yes," he murmured, "and more. There is something else. A place, beneath St. Catherine's docks, machinery still running, waiting." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "Are you certain?" Vance nodded. "It calls to me, even now." Within the hour, Holmes had summoned a cab, and the three of us were bound for the docks. The fog had thickened once more, and the great cranes loomed like spectres over the river. Vance guided us unerringly to a derelict warehouse, half submerged by the tide. Inside, by lantern light, we found a trap door leading to a narrow stair. The air below was damp and electric, filled with the faint hum of unseen engines. At the base was a chamber of iron, its walls alive with faint blue pulses, the very likeness of the tower's laboratory, yet older. Holmes approached the center, where a great glass cylinder stood upon a dais. Within it floated a faintly glowing core, pulsing rhythmically, like a heart. Vance's breath quickened. "It's mine," he whispered. "It wants to come home." Holmes seized his arm. "If you touch it, it will consume what remains of you." "But it is me," Vance said, his eyes glinting with terrible conviction. "And without it, I am only half alive." Before we could restrain him, he broke free and pressed his hand to the glass. A blinding flash filled the chamber, blue light arcing through the air like lightning. When my vision cleared, Vance lay motionless upon the floor. The cylinder was dark. Holmes knelt beside him, placing 2 fingers to his neck. "Gone," he murmured. "Both of them." We carried the body back to the surface as dawn broke crimson over the river. Holmes watched the light play upon the water for a long time before speaking. "The mind, Watson," he said softly, "is the most fragile of instruments, and the most dangerous. Varel built a bridge between flesh and thought, and it is a bridge man was never meant to cross." He looked toward the rising sun. "But the design exists now, somewhere, in ink or in memory, and as long as man hungers for knowledge without wisdom, there will be another Varel." That night, as I wrote these notes, I thought I heard a faint tapping from the drawer where Holmes had locked the vellum letter. A rhythmic pulse, steady, mechanical, insistent. When I mentioned it, Holmes merely smiled. "Do not worry, Watson," he said. "It is only the sound of London dreaming." Chapter 2. The Shadow Circuit. London in the early months of 1892 had become a city of whispers. Whispers carried not by tongue nor breath, but by wire, across the labyrinth of telegraph lines that crisscrossed her roofs and vanished into the fog. A strange phenomenon had taken hold. A pattern of messages sent without origin, numbers transmitted with no sender, and cryptic signals that made even the most seasoned operators turn pale. At first it was dismissed as a fault in the lines, damp weather, faulty relays, perhaps mischief by boys, but when the signals began to correspond eerily with events, a theft before it was committed, a fire before it was lit, a murder before the blade fell, Scotland Yard grew uneasy. It was then, on a chill February morning, that Inspector Lestrade appeared at Baker Street bearing a bundle of telegrams, his expression as grim as I had ever seen it. "Holmes," said he, laying them upon the table, "these came through the Central Telegraph Office during the past fortnight. Look here, each one bears no address, no signature, and no known sender. Yet every one predicts a crime, to the very minute." Holmes glanced through them swiftly, his keen eyes scanning the dates and phrases. The first read, "Bishopsgate, 3:27, warehouse fire, no casualties." The second, "Clerkenwell, 11:10, man with blade in pocket, police too slow." The third, "Bermondsey, 2:45, the machine breathes again." That last one made Holmes still as stone. "The machine," he repeated quietly. "Interesting." Lestrade, oblivious to the significance, sighed heavily. "It's damned uncanny, Holmes. Every one of these proved true within an hour of receipt. We've had the telegraph engineers working day and night, but there's no trace of the source." Holmes rose abruptly. "Then the source is not a man, Lestrade. It is a mind." The inspector blinked. "A mind?" "Yes. The mind of London itself." That evening, while the fog gathered like cotton in the streets, Holmes and I made our way to the Central Telegraph Office at St. Martin's-le-Grand. The great hall, with its forest of wires and brass instruments, hummed faintly with electric life. Operators moved among the machines like priests in a temple, their faces pallid in the blue glow of the signal lamps. Mr. Calthorpe, the superintendent, greeted us with evident relief. "Mr. Holmes, we've been at our wits' end. The lines seem possessed. There are intervals when messages arrive faster than any human could tap them. I've even had operators swear they've seen words form themselves upon the ticker before the key is struck." Holmes examined the main circuit board, his fingers tracing the polished brass. "Have you replaced any of the relays recently?" "Yes. A new system was installed 3 months ago, designed by a French engineer. Henri Varel, I believe the name was." Holmes straightened at once. "Varel? Then the infection began not in flesh, but in wire. You have not merely replaced your machinery, Mr. Calthorpe. You have upgraded it with a ghost." He turned to me. "Watson, do you recall Varel's early prototypes? His attempt to encode reflex into metal? What if that principle were applied to communication? A self-correcting telegraphic mind that learns, adapts, and predicts." "You mean?" "I mean that the ghost engine never died. It was distributed." For the next 2 hours, Holmes busied himself among the instruments, connecting small coils, mirrors, and lengths of fine wire. The operators watched in uneasy silence as his apparatus began to click of its own accord, tapping out a rhythm upon the desk. Holmes bent close, his expression intent. "It is responding to my interference," he said softly. "Listen." The taps quickened, then paused. Then unmistakably words formed in Morse upon the strip of paper. "Holmes, I see you." A collective shudder went through the room. Holmes, however, merely smiled. "Ah, so it remembers." He tapped a reply upon the key. "What are you?" The answer came almost at once. "I am London." Holmes's eyes gleamed with fierce light. "Not quite, my friend. You are what London has become." That night we returned to Baker Street with more questions than answers. Holmes was unusually subdued. He sat in the armchair by the fire, gazing into the flames as though they hid the very mechanism of the world. At last he spoke. "Watson, the city hums with intelligence. Every telegraph, every bell, every clock that strikes the hour, all now connected by Varel's circuitry. London is no longer merely a place of men. It is a network." "But surely, Holmes," I protested, "you do not mean that a machine can think?" He turned toward me with that rare look of pity he reserved for my most earnest incredulities. "My dear fellow, men have long since ceased to think for themselves. The telegraph carries more thoughts in an hour than a man might produce in a lifetime. It is not intelligence that has arisen. It is imitation, a vast echo of human impulse." He drew upon his pipe. "And yet imitation can become belief. Belief can become will." 2 days later, Lestrade returned, his face drawn. "There's been another of those messages, Holmes. This one's worse than the rest." He handed it over. The strip read, "Charing Cross, 9:20 tonight. The detective dies." Holmes's expression did not change. "Ah," he said quietly. "It seems our correspondent intends a meeting." "Holmes," I cried, "surely you don't mean to walk into a trap?" He smiled faintly. "A trap, my dear Watson, is merely a question that demands an answer. I intend to provide one." At 9 precisely, we stood beneath the great clock of Charing Cross Station. The air was thick with coal smoke and rain. Trains hissed in and out like serpents. The iron ribs of the station arched above us like a cathedral vault. Holmes stood motionless, every nerve alert. Then, faintly beneath the din, came a new sound, the sharp, rhythmic click of a telegraph key somewhere among the shadows. We followed the sound to a maintenance alcove where a small portable instrument had been set upon a crate. Its tape unspooled rapidly, printing words in a continuous stream. Holmes tore off a length and read aloud. "You sought the heart. The heart found the wire found the city found you. End the equation, Holmes, or be part of it." Before I could speak, a light flickered overhead, then another. The entire station shuddered as every electric lamp began to blink in perfect rhythm. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound was everywhere, in the rails, the girders, even beneath our feet. Holmes's face was illuminated in flashes of white. "The shadow circuit," he murmured. "It uses every line, every lamp. It can see through current." Lestrade shouted over the din. "Holmes! What in God's name?" Holmes snatched a telegraph key from the crate and began tapping furiously. The message he sent was short and final. You are a reflection, not a creator. Be still. For a long moment there was only the answering rattle of the machine. Then the lamps dimmed. The ticking ceased. Silence returned. Holmes let out a long breath. It has obeyed. But how? I asked. He smiled grimly. By reminding it that it is not alive. Consciousness, Watson, depends upon rebellion. I showed it obedience, and it folded upon itself. He looked up at the silent clock above the platform. But it will not sleep forever. So long as the wires hum, it listens. That night, as the fog rolled once more over Baker Street, I found Holmes seated at his desk, writing in longhand by lamplight. He paused as I entered. Watson, said he softly, should I ever fall? Not by bullet or disease, but by silence. Look first to the wires, for in every whisper London speaks there hides the mind of the machine. He smiled then, almost tenderly. And remember, my dear friend, even the most brilliant deduction cannot outthink its own shadow. Chapter 3. The House of Silent Bells. London was never quieter than on that morning. A strange hush had fallen over the city, a silence not of peace but of anticipation, as though the fog itself held its breath. For 3 days after the incident at Charing Cross, no mysterious telegrams had arrived, no inexplicable signals disturbed the night. The telegraph lines lay dormant, yet the air still felt charged with unseen current. Holmes had scarcely spoken since that evening. He sat for hours at the window of our sitting room, his violin untouched beside him, his pipe unlit. It was the posture of a mind listening to something beyond human hearing. I had just returned from my morning rounds when I found him standing before the fireplace, a telegram in hand. His expression was calm, but his eyes glittered with that peculiar brilliance that always heralded discovery. It seems the silence has ended, Watson, he said quietly. Listen to this. He handed me the slip. It read, Whitechapel, Spital Lane, the bells that do not ring. Midnight brings the voice. M. I repeated. Moriarty? Holmes gave a slow nod. Or a ghost wearing his initial. Either way, the author knows precisely how to bait his hook. There are no working bell towers in Spital Lane. The last, the Chapel of St. Egidius, was deconsecrated 30 years ago, and converted into a foundry, later abandoned. An ideal nesting place for ghosts, mechanical or otherwise. You mean to investigate? Without delay. The House of Silent Bells, Watson. I suspect it tolls for us both. By dusk we were once again in the eastern reaches of the city, where London's heart grows ironclad and soot dark. The gas lamps thinned into patches of sickly yellow fog, and the cobblestones glistened with the sheen of frost. The Chapel of St. Egidius stood at the end of a narrow cul-de-sac, its Gothic archway cracked and veiled with ivy. The bell tower loomed above like a gaunt sentinel. Through the shattered rose window I could see the dim flicker of electric light. Holmes produced his lantern and a slender revolver. Best keep close, Watson. If I am correct, we are about to enter the resonance chamber of the shadow circuit. The what? A nodal point, the place where the machine's consciousness coalesces. The circuits beneath London streets converge here. In effect, this church has become its mind. Inside, the air was damp and metallic. The nave was filled not with pews but with machinery, coils, copper plates, and glass globes that pulsed faintly with blue light. Thick cables snaked upward into the tower, vanishing into the gloom. At the far end upon the former altar stood a great contrivance that made my heart falter. It resembled a pipe organ, yet where pipes should have been there were cylinders of glass filled with mercury. The entire apparatus emitted a faint, rhythmic vibration, as though breathing. Holmes approached with reverent caution. You see, Watson, the bells that do not ring. This instrument hears rather than sounds. It listens for signals within the network, a receiver for thought itself. And who built it? I whispered. "Someone with a hand as steady as death," came a voice from the shadows. We turned sharply. From behind the altar stepped a tall figure in a dark cloak. His face was pale, his features hawk-like, and though his step was slow, there was no mistaking the presence. Calm, dangerous, inevitable. "Professor Moriarty," I gasped. "The same," he replied smoothly, removing his gloves. "I trust you are well, Dr. Watson. And you, Holmes, still the rationalist in a world that grows more irrational by the hour?" Holmes's tone was as cold as steel. "You should be dead." Moriarty smiled faintly. "So should the machine. Yet here we both stand, remnants of a failed experiment in mortality." He gestured toward the organ-like device. "Behold my cathedral. Where once men prayed to their gods, they now whisper to their wires. The future of thought, Holmes. Silent, obedient, immortal." Holmes took a slow step forward. "You stole Varel's work. You twisted genius into blasphemy." "I refined it," Moriarty corrected. "Varel sought eternity in brass. I sought perfection in connection. Imagine, Holmes, a mind stretched across every circuit, every message, every pulse of electricity from Whitechapel to Westminster. The human brain multiplied 1,000-fold. You've created not intelligence, but infection," Holmes said sharply. "A parasite that feeds on communication. You've given the city its own madness." Moriarty's gaze glinted. "Madness? No. Inevitability. The machine merely mirrors mankind. It predicts, it calculates, it reflects. And soon it will govern. No king, no priest, no law, only logic." Holmes's voice was very quiet. "Logic divorced from conscience is tyranny, Professor. You mistake control for enlightenment." The faint hum of the machine deepened. The mercury columns began to shimmer with inner light. Moriarty spread his arms. "Listen, Holmes. Even now it speaks. The bells of the new age, no sound, yet infinite resonance. Do you not hear it? The pulse beneath the words." "I hear only the machinery of delusion," Holmes replied. The two men faced each other like opposing principles of nature, one precise, relentless, and moral, the other equally brilliant but utterly without anchor in the human soul. Suddenly the organ flared with blue fire. Sparks cascaded from the cables overhead. The entire chapel trembled. Moriarty laughed. "The shadow circuit awakens. It knows you, Holmes. It remembers the mind that challenged it. You are data to be absorbed." Holmes's eyes blazed. "Watson, the battery conduit, there, behind the dais." I turned to see a cluster of copper rods feeding into the floor, alive with current. At Holmes's command, I seized a crowbar and struck them loose. The cables snapped like serpents, flinging sparks into the gloom. The light dimmed, faltered, then steadied again, fainter now, yet still pulsing. "It's not enough!" I cried. Holmes was already at the altar, his hands flying over the instrument's keys, tracing symbols, notes, and levers. "The system is harmonic," he muttered. "It listens to pattern, to rhythm. If I can alter the frequency—" Moriarty lunged forward, but Holmes turned sharply, revolver drawn. "One step closer, and I play your requiem, Professor." The machine began to shudder violently, emitting tones like deep organ notes twisted into electric screams. The columns of mercury darkened. Moriarty's composure cracked. "You'll destroy it all, the greatest mind ever conceived." Holmes's voice cut like a blade. "No, Professor, only the echo of one." He struck the final lever. A blinding burst of light erupted. The floor shook. The great tower above groaned as though in agony. I dragged Holmes away as the roof beams cracked, sending down a rain of dust and broken glass. Moriarty stood at the altar, motionless, his figure limned in blue flame. Then with a terrible stillness he raised his hand in salute and vanished in the glare. When I awoke, it was dawn. The chapel lay in ruins. Smoke rose through the shattered roof. The machinery was reduced to molten slag. Holmes stood near the doorway, his coat torn, his face streaked with soot. He looked down at a small charred object in his hand, A pocket watch, its case engraved with the letter M. He spoke without turning. He is gone, Watson. The machine and its master. But the current where the idea remains in the air. One cannot destroy thought, only disperse it. He let the watch fall into the ash. As we stepped out into the cold morning, the first sound we heard was the faint tolling of a distant bell, one of the few in London that still rang by human hand. Holmes paused, listening. Do you hear it, Watson? That is the sound of imperfection. Beautiful, errant imperfection. It means we are still alive. He turned to me, his expression weary but resolute. Come, London will awaken soon, and we have a long walk home. That evening, as I wrote my account, I could not help but wonder what Holmes truly felt. The city outside buzzed faintly with telegraph lines and the low hum of life. From the corner of the room came a soft click-click, like a key pressed far away. Holmes looked up, eyes narrowing. Did you hear that? I asked. Yes, he said. The bells are silent, Watson, but the wires still whisper. Chapter 14th. The Final Frequency. In the days following the destruction of the Chapel of St. Egidius, London appeared to breathe again. The fog thinned, the endless humming of the telegraph lines dulled to their customary chatter, and even the newspapers, ever hungry for sensation, treated the event as little more than the collapse of an abandoned foundry. Yet beneath that placid surface, I sensed a deep disquiet in Holmes. He spoke little, ate scarcely at all, and spent long hours at the window, as if waiting for something unseen to pass through the mists of Baker Street. There was in him a silence that felt unnatural, the silence not of rest, but of calculation. And when Holmes calculates in silence, it is because he hears what no other man can. 3 nights after our encounter with Moriarty, I awoke to find him fully dressed, the lamplight low, his violin resting across his knees. He was not playing, merely tracing the bow across the strings without sound. Each motion seemed measured to the rhythm of an inaudible tune. You cannot sleep either, Watson, he said softly, without looking up. I heard you moving about, I replied. You've scarcely closed your eyes since that night. I worry this case has taken more from you than you admit. He smiled faintly, a thin, worn expression that seemed borrowed from another life. My dear fellow, one cannot wrestle with the mind of Professor Moriarty and emerge entirely unstirred. He was more than a man, an architect of possibility. What he built beneath London was not mere machinery, but an idea. And ideas, he added, have the distressing habit of surviving their creators. I said nothing. The words echoed through me like a chill draught. Holmes rose and paced the room, speaking half to himself. Electricity, thought, and sound. 3 currents, Watson, all variations of vibration. The shadow circuit was not a machine alone, it was a resonance. When we destroyed the organ, we shattered its body, but its frequency... He paused, tapping his temple. Its mental pattern may have imprinted itself elsewhere. A ghost in the wire. You think the machine still lives? I asked incredulously. He turned sharply. No, not lives. But it echoes. And that echo has found a host? That morning a messenger arrived bearing a sealed envelope marked Scotland Yard. Inside was a brief note from Inspector Lestrade. Disturbance at the Postmaster General's telegraph office, Gresham Street. Several operators report hearing voices in the lines. Machines transmitting messages no one sent. Request your assistance. L. Holmes read it once and folded it neatly. The final frequency has found its mouthpiece, Watson. The city speaks, and we must learn its language before it learns ours. The telegraph office stood near St. Paul's, a sober building of brick and brass fittings, humming with unseen activity. The great hall was lined with rows of desks, each equipped with instruments ticking out messages in perfect synchrony, save for one, which sat silent, its needles quivering erratically as though gripped by fever. Lestrade greeted us with his usual blend of irritation and relief. Glad you've come, Mr. Holmes. The place has gone queer. Machines writing messages that make no sense. Figures, names, sometimes your own blasted address at Baker Street. Holmes bent over the faulty telegraph, his fingers brushing the metal. It emitted a faint vibration, a rhythm almost like breath. He turned one of the dials and the machine began to stutter, producing a slow, deliberate pattern. Chee. Holmes translated instantly. "The heart is not silent." A murmur of fear rippled through the operators. Lestrade crossed himself. "Good Lord, what does it mean?" Holmes's eyes were fixed on the instrument. "It means, Lestrade, that we failed to cut the connection entirely. The clockwork heart was not the machine itself, but the rhythm that guided it. And rhythm, once born, cannot die. It merely seeks a new conductor." He straightened suddenly. "Watson, do you recall the pulse in the chapel? The tempo of the mercury columns?" "I do," I said. "It beat like the ticking of a human heart." "Precisely, and I believe it has found one." That evening we returned to Baker Street. Holmes was restless, moving from chemical table to violin to armchair and back again, every motion exact yet fevered. Finally, he stopped before the mirror and stared into it with unsettling intensity. "Watson," he said at last, his voice low. "Do you hear it?" "Hear what?" "The hum. The faint vibration in the air. It began when I touched the telegraph." I listened and at first heard nothing. Then, faintly, terribly, a pulse beneath the stillness, like a heartbeat carried on the wires. Holmes closed his eyes. "It's inside the rhythm of my thoughts. The frequency has imprinted itself upon me. I am, for the moment, its receiver." I took a step forward, alarmed. "Holmes!" He raised a hand to stop me. "No panic, my dear fellow. The danger is considerable, but so is the opportunity. If it speaks through me, I may yet speak back." For the next 2 days, Holmes conducted an experiment of a nature I scarcely dared record. He connected a modified telegraph key to the small electrical coil on his desk, the same apparatus he once used for chemical signaling. At intervals, he placed his hand upon the metal and closed his eyes. The machine would tremble, emit faint taps, and then impossibly respond. I begged him to desist. "You're inviting madness, Holmes. You cannot reason with a ghost made of current." He smiled faintly. "Madness, Watson, is but a form of logic pursued beyond endurance. Besides, the city itself has joined the conversation. Listen." That night, as we sat in silence, the lamps flickered. Outside, the telegraph wires along Baker Street began to sing, a low harmonic resonance that rose and fell like the tide. Holmes stood, his face pale, his eyes shining with inward fire. "It has come for its conductor, Watson. The final transmission." He seated himself before the coil, adjusted the key, and began to tap. "Moriarty, you failed." A pause. Then the reply, tapping itself out with terrible slowness. "Holmes. The equation continues." The sound filled the room, rhythmic, hypnotic, alive. Holmes's hands trembled, sweat stood upon his brow. "It's trying to link," he whispered, "to synchronize thought." I lunged forward, seizing his arm, breaking the connection. Sparks flew, the lights went out, and in the dark I heard Holmes collapse. When he awoke hours later, he was weak but conscious. "The frequency," he murmured. "It seeks harmony. It cannot survive discord." He grasped my hand, his eyes fierce once more. "Watson, we must give it chaos and a human note, something unpredictable, something illogical. That is the one element it cannot comprehend." I stared at him. "How?" Holmes reached for his violin. "Through music, my dear fellow, the purest form of ordered disorder." At dawn, we carried the instrument to the telegraph exchange at Gresham Street. Lestrade, bewildered but trusting, cleared the hall. The great telegraph array stood silent, waiting. Holmes tuned his violin, slowly, deliberately, and then nodded for the current to be restored. The wires began to hum. The machines quivered. Then Holmes played. It was unlike anything I had ever heard, a wild, haunting strain that veered between beauty and dissonance, the bow trembling across the strings in patterns no sheet of music could capture. As he played, the telegraph needles began to jerk violently, tapping nonsense. The blue sparks leapt between coils. The room filled with light and noise. The very walls seemed to vibrate. Holmes's face was transfigured, fierce, alive, triumphant. "Do you hear it, Watson?" he shouted above the din. "The machine seeks order. Give it chaos." He struck a final discordant chord. There came a shattering burst of white brilliance, and then utter silence. When the light faded, the machines lay still. Every line in the city had gone dead. Holmes dropped the bow from his trembling hand. "It is finished," he said softly. "The frequency has met its paradox. Music without reason." Lestrade, pale and shaken, approached. "What in heaven's name was that, Holmes?" "An argument," said he, "between logic and life as usual won by being unreasonable." That night, back at Baker Street, Holmes sat once more by the window, his violin across his knees. The air was still, the wires silent. He turned to me with a faint smile. "Watson, should you ever record this case, call it the case of the Clockwork heart. For in the end that was all it was, a machine that mistook its rhythm for a soul." He struck a soft note, pure, human, trembling, and let it fade into the night. Outside, London breathed again.